First Samuel is, we can tell from the Hebrew text that it was composed maybe by a few different or a couple of different voices. And so sometimes the Hebrew is a little tough. And so the English is a little tough. And sometimes things don't quite make sense on the surface. And so I'll give my best shot at giving an answer if you have a particular question. One thing I know for sure, and this is because of our friend John French, I'm pretty sure he and Becky, when they come to Bible study, they come in the evening slot, has asked me some questions about some of the names and places. A lot of them, your guess is as good as mine. One of the main themes of, I think, 1st and 2nd Samuel and all the monarchy stories is that Israel went from this disparate group of tribes and families and kind of nomadic people to a unified people. And if we read some names that we look up maybe in a Bible dictionary or a concordance or something, and there's maybe only 1 or 2 instances of them, really all I can say to that is they were part of this disparate group of people who worshiped Yahweh. And so if one of your questions was, who are the so-and-sos? Maybe just take that answer. And if you want to specifically ask me about it, if like you saw something on the internet or whatever else, we can talk about that too. So just wanted to begin there. Before we begin diving into 1 Samuel 12, let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, in this time carved out for us, we ask that you would speak to us through your word. We ask that you would show us something new and fresh about who you are, your character, what you desire for your people, what you desire for creation, what you desire for the world. Help us have that single-minded devotion that you are our King, that you are our Lord, that you alone reign over us. Foster that posture in our heart. Be with us in this time of study and be with Pastor Brad as he undergoes surgery this morning. We ask that you be with him and with Laura in healing and recuperation. We hope to see him again soon. We ask all of this in the name of your Son, Jesus the Christ, our King. Amen. So let's just get to it. We have a lot to cover. You can see 1 Samuel 12 through 15, and some places I'll read, some places I'll just kind of give a little synopsis so you can kind of read on your own. It's not the most riveting thing to read aloud in a group setting, but we'll go through it together. I have here as like the subtitle of today's study, Saul's downfall. I might add a caveat of like the beginning of Saul's downfall. It's not like here in these chapters we find today, Saul is deleted from existence and we don't hear from him again. He's around for a little bit longer, and Brad will tackle those chapters about Saul's presence even in the midst of this new chosen person, King David. So we'll just start in chapter 12. But before we start in chapter 12, we'll kind of pick up the tail end of chapter 11 where Brad left off this week. Saul is he's already been chosen as king, but because of his rescue of the city of Jabesh, he is now confirmed. Like, this is our guy. This is who we confirm as king. God has obviously chosen this person. We've had this great victory. The Spirit of God has descended upon Saul, and Samuel's like, this is it. The text is kind of small, but I had a little speech bubble, like Saul saying, naysayers welcome, because there's this interesting moment at the end of chapter 11 where he's being confirmed as king. And then the people then said to Samuel, who was it that asked, shall Saul reign over us? Turn these men over to us so that we may put them to death. So who are the people that didn't want this guy? He's great. We should kill the people that didn't like him. And Saul, in his gracious, humble attitude, says, no one will be put to death today. For this day, the Lord has rescued Israel. So he's feeling pretty good about himself. He's like, no need to execute the naysayers. They can be part of this whole thing as well. And so we move on, and then we get to what's a lot of kind of chapter titles in chapter 12 call Samuel's farewell speech. Before we begin there's this TV critic, Grant Martin, who wrote this book called Difficult Men. And in it, he talks about, a lot of people say we're living in the golden age of television, which for a lot means there's a lot of television shows, and some of them stand out as like these great works of episodic art. And for the 2000s up to now, I've given like 4 examples from his book up here, like Mad Men, Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, which is kind of having a resurgence right now with James Gandolfini, his death, and then this impending prequel movie that's coming out. And then Idris Elba's character in The Wire, this HBO show about Baltimore. Have any of you watched any of these television shows before? Some of them are kind of racy. So if you're scared to say yes because there's a pastor here, it's okay. each of these men, these main characters in these television shows, Don Draper, Walter White, Tony Soprano, they're criminals. They're adulterers. They're not men of great character. They have a lot of complicated issues in their lives. And for some reason, somehow, you get sucked into these shows. And like Walter White, for example, he's like making crystal meth and selling it. And he's like made this amazing crystal meth that people in his area really, really like. And he's a chemistry teacher. That's because he has cancer. He needs to raise money so he can, survive his cancer treatment. And somehow you root for this guy. And he's like he's a horrible egomaniac, very self-centered. But somehow we root for him. And in this book, Difficult Men, this TV critic says, it's kind of plumbing the depths of like the human psyche. Like, what makes us root for people that are complicated and kind of jerks, And I kind of want to add that as a frame of thinking about the monarchy stories. Like sometimes we root for people, like we talk about King David as like this amazing person, and like spoiler alert, he's not a perfect person. And we'll find out today, Saul is not a perfect person. Samuel is not a perfect person. Jonathan, Saul's son, not a perfect person. And so I think having that frame of like, these people are complicated, but something in us like wants them to succeed, wants them to be better than they appear to be. And I think having that frame, not that, Don Draper, Walter White, or Tony Soprano, or anybody like that are, biblical in scale at all, but they help us kind of see in our own culture, people are people. And for centuries, we've rooted for people that are difficult, that are complicated. And I think it's because, I would have to say, a theological, anthropological point, it's because we're complicated. And we're not, as far as I know, cooking crystal meth. But we see in ourselves our flaws, and we root for ourselves nonetheless. So keep that frame in mind. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Hope that's helpful. So in chapter 12, let's get a little bit of signpost for the way that we'll go. In chapter 12, Samuel says goodbye. He kind of sees his career as leader of the Israelites coming to an end because now Saul has been chosen as king. Saul and Samuel, there's a space there, butt heads, not Saul and Samuel butt heads. They kind of have some conflict here in these 4 chapters. Jonathan attacks the Philistines. Saul jumps the gun, which is Saul decides he's going to do some divination to do God a favor. Saul finds himself unarmed. Then Jonathan goes rogue again in chapter 14. And then chapter 15, God is over Saul. Like, I'm done with Saul. I'm going to pick somebody else. So those are kind of the broad sweeping signposts as we go through chapter 12 through 15. So here's the beginning of the long goodbye. I'll read these kind of chunks together and we'll hit some points along the way. I'm reading out of the NIV, just so you know. Samuel said to all Israel, I have listened to everything you said to me and have set a king before you, regretfully. Now you have a king as your leader. As for me, I am old and gray. My sons are here with you. I have been your leader from my youth until this day. Here I stand. Testify against me in the presence of the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Whose donkey have I taken? Whom have I cheated? Whom have I oppressed? From whose hand have I accepted a bribe to make me shut my eyes? If I have done any of these things, I will make it right. He's kind of putting himself on the line here. You have not cheated or oppressed us, they replied. You have not taken anything from anyone's hand. Samuel said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and also his anointed is witness this day. So Saul is a witness to this as well, because the power is being transferred over to him. That you have not found anything in my hand. He is witness, they said. Then Samuel said to the people, it is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your ancestors up out of Egypt. Now then, stand here, because I am going to confront you with evidence before the Lord as to all the righteous acts performed by the Lord for you and your ancestors. So Samuel's confirming his uprightness. Moses did the same thing when Moses passed off the power to Joshua. It's like, look, I've done everything I'm supposed to do. For Moses, it was like, I failed in one capacity. That's why I can't go to the promised land. But like kind of recounting, look at all the great things that God has done among us through me. And it's recalling Moses and Aaron. Samuel is in a long line of prophets that we'll see all throughout the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament. Jesus does this. Remember that God delivered you as slaves out of Egypt. Remember what God did for you in the family of Abraham. Paul does the same thing, recalls these great acts of God in history. It's a reclamation and a recalling of this. God is not absent and disinterested in human affairs, but is super involved in the life of his people, in the Israelites. And then for us as Christians, we believe that God came to be with us in a person, in Jesus, and was really, really involved with humanity, is not set apart far away, but close alongside us. And recalling these accounts of what God has done through these particular people is an example of that. So recalling the acts of God. So then he goes on to say, after Jacob entered Egypt, they cried to the Lord for help. And the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your ancestors out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God. So this is a pendulum that swings all throughout the Old Testament. Righteous people, they're following God, they're all for him. They get delivered from Egypt, and then they grumble, like, I'd rather go back to Egypt. Then they're given judges to rule over them. Then they complain and say, like, can't we have a king like the other people? They back and forth, turn toward God, turn away from God, turn toward God, turn away from God, back and forth. This is the rhythm of the history of God's people. So he sold them into the hand of Sisera. So we see this God that kind of accommodates human desire. Like, sure, do it your way, have what you want, see how it works out for you. I know Brad, that's a common thread that Brad has drawn out in the study so far. The commander of the army of Hazor into the hands of the Philistines and the king of Moab, who fought against them. They cried out to the Lord and said, we've sinned, we have forsaken the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashereths. But now deliver us from the hands of your enemies, and we will serve you. Then the Lord sent Jerubbaal, Barak, Jephthah, and Samuel. And you may have a note in your Bible where it says Samuel there. Okay, we could be talking about the Samuel from this story. Some Masoretic Hebrew texts say Samson. Say Shimshon, which is the Hebrew text, Samson. So he's talking about the judges. It'd be weird to kind of like skip over Samson and go right to Samuel. Either way, the point stands. God has sent you these men of character to rule over you and to help you organize your life. And he delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around you so that you lived in safety. So turn away from God, cry out to him. God's like, okay, like, are you sure this time? You like, if you want me to rule over you, you have to listen to me. And here's the people I sent. They're like, sure, cool. And then we know inevitably they're going to turn away again. But when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was your king. This is a weird passage weird verse in this passage in verse 12. When they saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, no, we want a king. That's not the original reasoning they gave for wanting a king, but that's at least Samuel's perspective. Like when you saw a threat to your stability through this king of the Ammonites, you decided that you wanted a king just like Nahash. But if we go back, we flip backwards a little bit in 1 Samuel, we see that actually the reasoning given in the original narrative was that Samuel's sons had kind of like messed up. And that's the reason they wanted a king. Like, we want something more stable. But from Samuel's perspective, or maybe from if there's two authors kind of, they're putting these two texts together in this monarchy tale, they say that it's because your life was threatened by this scary guy named Nahash, and that's why you want a king. Again, the point still stands. You felt unstable being ruled by Yahweh, so you wanted to be like the other nations. Now, here's the king. So again, God accommodates the request. Sure, have it your way. I'll pick somebody for you. Here's the king you have chosen, the one you asked for. See, the Lord has set a king over you. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him, so these if-then, these kind of conditional statements really pack a punch in 1 Samuel. If you fear the Lord and serve and obey him and do not rebel against his commands, and if both you and the king who reigns over you follow the Lord your God, so it's not just the people, like the king has to stay straight too, good. But if you do not obey the Lord, and if you rebel against his commands, his hand will be against you. Not a good thing. And it was as it was against your ancestors. So you remember not only the great things God has done, but remember your grandma and great-grandpa and great-uncles, they turned away too, and things did not go well. So if you imagine maybe this First Samuel account, as some scholars believe, some of it was written post-exile or even in the middle of the exile when the Israelites were not in their nation, when they're not in the promised land anymore, they were under the Babylonians. You could see like, oh, like this is reminding us maybe we're here because we turned away. You're remembering and recalling the people of your past so you don't make their same mistakes. We have a kind of cultural axiom. We say the same thing, like those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it, or whatever paraphrase of that quote you want to use. It's the same sentiment. Like we forget the mistakes of the past, we repeat the mistakes of the past. And for Israel, the big mistake is idolatry, which is choosing someone else to worship and to have lead you. So that is the big mistake. Any questions before I move on to Samuel's big confirming miracle about anything that he says here, kind of warning them? He's like, the power is passing on to Saul. Good luck, have fun. Yeah. Yeah, they don't question why do you, so the question for folks online is that they don't seem to question why Samuel like is confirming that this is the guy. Why do you guys think that is? Yeah, he's in charge. They trust him. Like, okay, if this is the guy, it's not only that, but they've witnessed now victory. They've witnessed a military victory under Saul. Like, oh, okay, we chose him. Then he did something really good, so we confirm him. And so it's kind of like a mix of things, their trust of Samuel and also this great military victory and rescue that they've witnessed. Also, we might see under the surface, they're just clamoring for somebody to rule over them. They want a king like everybody else has a king. So it's like, okay, sure. We might even be maybe a pessimistic or cynical reading, but I think a fair reading would be like, they'll take anybody at this point. They just want to have a king like Nahash, which is not a good look, but whatever. Verse 16, let's keep going. Now then, stand still and see this great thing the Lord is about to do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest now? I will call on the Lord to send thunder and rain, and you will realize what an evil thing you did in the eyes of the Lord when you asked for a king. Samuel is not warm and cozy sugarcoating with the Israelites right now. I'm going to do this sign so you know how evil you are. Cool. Then Samuel called on the Lord, and that same day the Lord sent thunder and rain, so all the people stood in awe of the Lord and of Samuel. Like, we get this confirmation of Saul that he's won this military victory, but really the kind of focal point of God's trust and work is in Samuel still. Like, Samuel is kind of this big warning, like, really, I want to drive the point home. Like imagining like one of the pastors here preaching and giving this really convicting sermon about your sin and failures or whatever, which not nice or kind or helpful in any sort of way. So it's a kind of finger wagging sermon. And then like to confirm how bad you are when you leave today, it's going to be raining. We got a 50% chance most of the time that like that could be true. I'm not going to give that a shot, but that's a kind of analogous, sort of comparison there. And so he's going to bring the rain. The Lord answered him. The people stood in awe. They're like, wow, look at this. Which you would think to be like, okay, never mind. Like whatever, if God doesn't want a king, we'll go back. But no, that's not what happens. The people all said to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God for your servants so that we will not die. For we've added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king. So like a measure of self-awareness. Do not be afraid, Samuel replied. You have done all this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. So that's you single-minded devotion. This is about God. This is not about me. It's not about Saul. Certainly not about you. Turn toward Yahweh. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you, because they are useless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. So like God is still on your side, but he still demands obedience from you. As for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you, and I will teach you the way that is good and right. Like, I'm not giving you this warning and saying turn toward God and then leaving you on your own. Like, I'm going to walk alongside you and help you do that, but you have to listen. Hence the thunder and the rain. As for me, so far be it from me that I won't pray for you. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. Consider what great things he has done for you. Again, remember God's work in history in the past. Yet, if, so an echo again of that if then, if you persist in doing evil, both you and your king will perish. Like determinative. This will happen if you do this. In Samuel's universe, just like in Deuteronomy or the Proverbs, if you do good, if you follow God, things will go well for you. If you mess up and turn away and decide to worship someone else, namely yourself or people that have no power, these idols that have no power, then things will go bad for you. A very ordered way of looking at how things turn out. From a theological perspective, I'm always struck in 1st and 2nd Samuel by these if-then statements. We have friends and brothers and sisters in Christ who say, God determined that Saul would be a failure, that David would sin and be a failure, that any king, good or bad, was good or bad from the beginning. From my biased Arminian, Wesleyan, free will perspective, you read the text plainly in Hebrew or English, no matter the English translation. Samuel seems to be presenting the fact that the future is bound by possibility. There is a road in which you serve God wholeheartedly and things go well for Israel. There is also a road, which we're about to see recorded in Scripture, where things do not go well because you turned away. This is not a study about free will, but just wanted to note that frame as you read the text, especially in the monarchy stories. That happens all the time. If you do this, then that will happen. If you do this, then that will happen. I think it's a point in the column for people that affirm human free will. But again, I was brainwashed at a Methodist seminary, so, I was determined so, maybe, according to my Presbyterian and Reformed friends. Anyway, nothing against them, lovely people. Just wrong theologically, I guess. Okay, moving on to chapter 13. So, yeah, Samuel and Saul at odds. I didn't say butt heads this time. I should change the phrasing. Saul was 30 years old when he became king. So Samuel's given this speech. The power is being shifted over now to Saul, away from me over to Saul. So we get this account of who Saul is. Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years. I'm curious, from your own translation, I imagine you all have various translations ahead of you. When it says Saul was 30 years old and he reigned for 42 years, what does your translation say? So I heard 80 and 82. 40 and 32. Yeah. Just leaves it open. There's ... That's very common. Due Reims, which is the translation that the Roman Catholic Church typically uses, actually in this point says Saul was 1 year old when he began to reign, which is they're just taking literally what some Hebrew texts say. But how was Saul head and shoulders above the rest when he was a 1 year old? Is kind of the critical question. The reason NIV says 30 and 42, so he was 30 and then he reigned for 42 years, is that in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that Jesus quoted from, that the New Testament authors quoted from when they quote the Old Testament, says 30 and 42 years. But when we look at the Masoretic text, when we look at the Hebrew text, it's ambiguous. So it's essentially ... and it's our best guess. And so we're trying to put those things together. I don't think you guys are smart, amazing people. Don't let that shake your trust in the scriptures. Saul, recording his age and how long he reigned, if your salvation hat is hung on that hat rack, let's have a conversation. The text is ambiguous there. I think is unimportant. But if you think it's really important, I'd love to talk to you about it. But just curious what your translations say. There's a variety of them. He was an ambiguous age. He was 1 year old. He was 30 years old. Take your pick. It's kind of funny to imagine a very tall 1 year old, but I don't think it textually bears out what happens. Okay, anyway, continuing. Verse 2, Saul chose 3,000 men from Israel. 2,000 were with him at Michmash and the hill country of Bethel. And 1,000 were with Jonathan. So enter Jonathan, first mention of him. There he is. At Gibeah in Benjamin, the rest of the men he sent back to their homes. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost at Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul had the trumpet blown throughout the land and said, "Let the Hebrews hear." So all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost. Now Israel has become obnoxious to the Philistines. And the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. So he's confirmed king, and he and his son Jonathan continue on their victory of being an annoyance to these other nations that also have kings just like them. The Philistines assembled to fight Israel with 3,000 chariots. Some texts say 30,000, so a lot of chariots. 6,000 charioteers and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. So the picture that's being painted is this an insurmountable army heading toward us? Can we take them on? Which we see, does this confirm Saul or God or Jonathan? Who does it kind of point to in the victory? They went up and, so the charioteers and soldiers as numerous as the sand of the sea, they went up and camped at Michmash east of Beth Aven. When the Israelites saw that their situation was critical and that their army was hard pressed, they hid in caves and thickets among the rocks and in pits and cisterns. So they turned tail and ran. After this long speech from Samuel, trust in God, he's on your side, they lost it and turned around and ran. You have a king just like them, and you're smaller in numbers, and you've seen these great victories that seem insurmountable, but you go and hide anyway. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead, so like really deserted. Saul remained at Gilgal, and all the troops with him were quaking with fear. They were so stoked at the beginning, and now not so much. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel. So remember, if you think back, I think chapter 10, Samuel tells Saul explicitly, wait 7 days for me, and then I'll come help. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So things were not looking good. They hid, and then they started to desert. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings." And Saul offered up the burnt offering. Just as he finished making the offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him. You may have already read ahead, but do you think that was a good decision? Yeah, not great. Do this, obey, listen. God told me that we should do this. Wait, I'll be there. Don't jump the gun, just wait. I'm kind of serving in this priest position, as a priest for you. I'm going to come and help you. And Saul sees that he's losing his men's confidence, and so he does the sacrifice anyway. So be obedient, and almost immediately Saul's like, I think I can handle this on my own. "What have you done?" asked Samuel. Saul replied, "When I saw that the men were scattering and that you did not come at the set time," so he's kind of blaming it on Samuel a little bit too, "and that the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." I'm like, I should do a sacrifice because what's happening is like I've not done the right thing. The right thing in the world of 1 Samuel is to listen, be obedient to the one that God's chosen and is anointed. To Saul, the right thing is to kind of like haphazardly do a religious ritual to somehow gain God's favor. It's kind of like divination. He's like doing a magic trick to like, God is going to be on my side. "Samuel, you have done a foolish thing. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had," so another if, leaving that open possibility, "if you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command." Then Samuel left Gilgal and went up to Gibeah in Benjamin, and Saul counted the men who were with him. They numbered about 600. We don't really get a response from Saul other than, okay, he leaves, or Samuel leaves, and then Saul counts his men to kind of reassess the situation. It's an odd exchange. The Saul thinks he's doing God and Samuel a favor, and Samuel gives him this horrible news. You were a king just for a little bit, and God has already kind of turned his favor away from you. Any questions about that kind of series of events there where Jonathan goes and does this mighty thing, Saul goes on to do a mighty thing and then kind of jumps the gun and messes up and doesn't do what he was told to do, and then this exchange between him and Samuel? Any thoughts about that? It all happens so fast. Mm-hmm. True. Yeah. So what she said was if Saul was only 1 year old, he couldn't have had a son. Because some people try to work the way around it and say God chose him when he was 1 year old and then he reigned. And it becomes a thing where like we start to occupy a lot of our time and attention on something that like doesn't seem to really hold a lot of, spiritual weight. So, but thanks for pointing that out. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. We see late. Well, this is a little foreshadowing too. We see later that Samuel kind of confronts Saul again and is like, stop messing up. And then Saul has this visceral reaction, like rip Saul's robe. And like, what can I do to resolve this? But here you're right. Instead of kind of like begging and pleading, like, okay, I'm sorry, how can we rectify this? Because it seems that the God of Israel is willing to kind of accommodate and work and try to work things out. He decides again to go back to this concrete military power thing of like, okay, I messed up. Who do I have left? Like, who's still going to stand beside me? And he's worried about his men standing beside him and not Yahweh standing beside him. And it's kind of a misoriented devotion. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That's great. Okay, this last little scene of chapter 13. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying at Gibeah in Benjamin while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah in the vicinity of Shual, another toward Beth Horon, and the third toward the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboyim, facing the wilderness. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So the Philistines have kind of run everybody off. So while Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened, the price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plow points and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. I am just so glad that the Bible has recorded how much it costs to get your weapon sharpened. That has helped me spiritually so deeply. I should not be so facetious about Holy Writ, but here we are. And it goes on to say, so on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear in his hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. We're seeing like this concrete falling apart of this military power. No weapons, unsharpened, no means of getting weapons or sharpening them beyond the Philistines. And then here, the only people that have weapons, and I think there's something to this theologically. I make that joke about, I'm glad this is in here. The only ones with sword and spear were Saul and Jonathan. At this point, do we trust Saul and Jonathan to be the only ones with weapons in their hands? I'm kind of ambivalent about it. No, and a little bit yes. Like they've had some victory, like maybe on their own without Yahweh, but also general trust, probably not. Like not the people I want to get behind. Like, okay, well, at least they have weapons and I have a blunt stick. Like, no, I'd rather have a weapon and I'd rather be behind a person that God has chosen. But the Israelites at this point don't know that God has lifted his favor from Saul. Any thoughts about chapter 13 before I move on? There's a lot there, but we want to cover these next 2 chapters in the time that we have left. Cool. So more Jonathan in chapter 14. Jonathan is an armor bearer. I found this cool painting. It's dark on the screen there, but of them coming out to taunt the Philistines and make this kind of weird deal with themselves about how God will confirm that they're on the right track. Chapter 14, or actually verse 23 at the end of 13 kind of begins this passage. Now a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash. So there's this group of Philistines out past Michmash, not in the campment anymore. One day, Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armor bearer, Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side. But he did not tell his father. Like something in the genes, I guess, to kind of make mischief and go your own way. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men. So he's chilling under a tree with the men that he's now counted. Among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. So this priestly garment kind of confirms his priestly power. He was a son of Ichabod's brother, Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. So we get this kind of list of names, who's present, and then a note again that nobody knew. They were kind of too busy hanging out to realize that Jonathan and his caddy had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. It was kind of this difficult terrain. One was called Bozez and the other Sine. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, the other to the south toward Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men." Interesting thing to note specifically about those men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. He has this idea of possibility. Maybe God's on our side in this sort of little secret mission that we're on. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. So like God can do what he wants. He could use me and you to make something happen. He could use thousands of men. He could use anybody he wants to. So maybe this is one of those instances where God does something amazing with just a couple of guys. Do all that you have in mind, his armor bearer said. Go ahead. I am with you heart and soul. This armor bearer is just like we hear the Israelites. Like, sure, yeah, whatever, that sounds fine. They say the same things to Samuel, like, whatever you think is right, whatever you think is best, just kind of fealty to Jonathan. I am with you, heart and soul. The good armor bearer, like he's doing his job, I guess. Jonathan said, come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. So we'll kind of stand in a prominent place at these cliffs so they can't quite get to us immediately, but they'll be able to see us surely. If they say to us, wait there until we come to you, we will stay where we are and not go up to them. So if they say they're coming to us, we'll stay. We'll just wait for them to come to us. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up. So we'll listen to the Philistines, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. We don't get any account that Jonathan knows this for a fact, but he just says, if they say stay put, we'll stay put. But if they say come up to us, we'll know that God is on our side, and we should feel pretty confident that we can take them. So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. I think there's a humorous scene, so just imagine it with me. Two guys, one overburdened, carrying all of Jonathan's stuff, strong, confident Jonathan, waving and making a scene. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of their holes they were hiding in. Like, look, they think we're gone. They're ready to come out. Look, we can get the high ground on them, literally. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan, his armor bearer, come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson. What an invitation. Stay in your hole or else. So Jonathan said to his armor bearer, climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. So Jonathan's little barter has been confirmed. Like if they say stay put, we'll stay put. But if they call us up, we know that God's on our side. So let's climb up there. So Jonathan and armor bearer go to meet them and to learn their lesson, I guess. Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet, as opposed to, with his armor bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, so they're winning, and his armor bearer followed and killed behind him too. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. So he was actually confirmed, he did it. He went up there and fought the Philistines, and God apparently was with them. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. So now we have some confirmation from the narrator, like God has set panic in the Philistines. Like these two guys came up and took out a lot of us, and it was a total surprise. We thought they were coming out of their hiding because they thought we were gone, but actually they came up and they've taken some of us out, and God has set a panic via Jonathan into the Philistines. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah and Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. So we get a kind of like a reverse situation. The Israel army melting away and hiding in caves. And then now, just by the power of two men, Jonathan and his armor bearer, the Philistines begin to melt away. Then Saul, presumably still hanging out under the pomegranate tree, having a good time, said to the men who were with him, muster the forces and see who has left us. So like, why is this happening? Like they didn't just start melting away for no reason. Somebody decided that they were going to do something. He doesn't know it's Jonathan. When they did, it was Jonathan and his armor bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God. At that time, it was with the Israelites. So y'all have already covered in this Bible study, like that the Philistines were like, here, you can have it back. We don't want it anymore, and this kind of give and take, push and pull of the ark. Some texts actually say, like the Septuagint, for instance, that they don't say bring the ark, but bring the ephod, bring this temple priestly garment. They're trying to do some divination here. Regardless, again, the point still stands. Whether it was bring the ark or bring the ephod, they were trying to muster up the spirit in the army at that time by whatever means. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. So withdraw your hand from like trying to raise up the spirit of our army to go like kind of see what's happening. Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Like, can you imagine, like, two men go into the Philistine army and they start killing them, and it kind of seems like there's not this giant army. Like, are there spies among us? They're just totally confused, totally caught off guard. They start striking one another. And again, remember, like, this is something that, for Samuel, says God has done. Like, he's struck this panic within the Philistines, and they're now hitting and harming each other. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went out over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. So ones that had deserted to the Philistines now went back to the Israelites. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Beth Aven. With no evidence, yeah. So again, you see, I wish there were another exchange here, or at least a little insight into Saul's mind of like, what does he think is happening? Does he think that this is just happening, just like, is he really just proud of Jonathan, that Jonathan's done this? We'll see that that's not entirely the case later. Like, what's going on? Because Samuel says, the first Samuel, the author of the book, not the prophet, or the judge. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel. So again, like, it's God that's doing this. God set the panic in the Philistines. God confirmed this barter that Jonathan had made with himself and with his armor bearer. Like, he's dealing with and putting up with people that really aren't doing everything in their own best interest. And so he's like pushing again, like, it's good for the Israelites to have victory over the Philistines because it says something about God. It seems to me that Saul does not recognize this, that despite God's best efforts, Saul still is like, we did pretty good today. Like, good job, Jonathan. So let's continue. In verse 24, let's see. Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies. So none of the troops tasted food. So this grasping of Saul to like, oh, we should do a religious ritual to kind of like confirm that that God did this, and we should not eat, we should fast. This it seems like a grasp to me, and maybe that's just my own reading, but that Saul, seeing the victory that they've had, is we should fast until we can avenge ourselves against the Philistines fully. And the guys have just won this victory, and he's like, okay, in exchange for your great victory, you can't eat. So congratulations. Verse 25, the entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out. If you recall Old Testament in general, especially for the people in the wilderness going to the promised land. Honey is a sign of God's presence and favor and abundance. Like you're going to a land of milk and honey. This God is pouring out this sweet thing that's a sign of his goodness. And so I think that's under the surface here for sure. So they saw the honey oozing out, yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. When Saul said not to eat, looks pretty good, but I'll pass. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. Absentee Jonathan, once again. So he reached out the end of the staff, and that was in his hand, and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth, and his eyes brightened. Some say his strength was renewed. Like this was super honey. There's a picture of Jonathan enjoying himself on the honeycomb. He was like, why wouldn't I? I'm hungry. And it brightens his eyes or strengthens him. Then one of the soldiers told him, your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, cursed be anyone who eats food today. That is why the men are faint. What a tattletale. I think we've all been in that situation before, where like a teacher or a boss or somebody tells you not to do something, and then somebody does it, and they're outed for it. Jonathan said, my father has made trouble for the country. He's made the men faint. He hasn't done what he's supposed to do. He doesn't seem to really be present, to be a military leader. I was actually the one that struck panic and fear in the Philistines. I can do what I want. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey? How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today. Some of the plunder they took from their enemies, would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater? Like, look what this honey did for me. My eyes are brightened, or I'm strengthened. Like, it gave me some vitality, whatever it is. If we all ate this, we could have beat him up even more. We could have been even better. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. My dad doesn't know what he's talking about. We should eat the honey. It'll make us stronger, and our plunder will be greater. That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, you're right, Peggy, some of these names just off the charts ridiculous. They were exhausted. They should have eaten the honey. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle, and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them together with the blood. Then, this is against the law, by the way. Then someone said to Saul, look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it. You have broken faith, he said. Roll a large stone over here at once. So it runs in the family again. This kind of, Saul decides to respond by rolling the stone over and punishing people for eating the meat with the blood in it. But anyway, this kind of two strikes of eating the wrong things in Saul's army, one by his son and then one by his men who've plundered all this stuff. Then he said, go out among the men and tell them, each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it. So don't be barbarians. Come eat it the right way. So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. Like Saul, over and over and over again, is like breaking his own duty and position by setting up an altar and doing this. And so I need to go a little bit quicker here, but where was I? Yeah, let's go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive. So he built this altar and now declares this, do whatever seems best to you. Again, the Israelites like, sure, sounds great, do whatever. But the priest said, let us inquire of God here. So Saul asked God, shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand? But God did not answer him that day. Wonder why. Saul therefore said, come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord, Samuel's already told him, but he's kind of wondering, like, why won't God listen to me? Why won't God answer my question? As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die. But not one of them said a word. Saul then said to all Israelites, you stand over there, and I and Jonathan will stand over there. And so we'll kind of glaze over this passage here, but they basically do, there's this, the Urim and the Thummim, or Urim and Thummim, this kind of pieces of the priestly garb, can also be used to like choose an either or of a question. I'm not wanting to discount but thinking about Hebrew and Israelite divination rituals, it's kind of Ouija board-ish. So like, if the answer is this, show this symbol. If the answer is this, show that symbol. And it ends up confirming that it's all Jonathan's fault because he ate the honey. Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel, never, as surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this today with God's help. So the men rescue Jonathan. So they decide, even though it was Jonathan's fault, they'll spare him. And after Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies, and kind of gives us like a brief accounting of all the things that Saul had done and part of his rule. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. And then it gives an account of his family there at the end of 14. We're at 10:52. Let's talk about chapter 15. So Saul is rejected then and told this by Samuel. And you can read that account of kind of their exchange. But I think the most interesting part is here in chapter 15, verse 27. He's kind of told him, obedience is better than your rituals. And that's why I kept pointing to that thing that Saul keeps doing. He wants to do sacrifices. He wants to set up an altar. He wants to do these religious rituals. And Samuel says in verse 22, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? God seeks obedience over religious ritual. To obey is better than sacrifice. To heed is better than the fat of rams. Like, because you don't listen, but you kill some animals and burn them on an altar, does not undo the fact that you didn't listen, is what Samuel is essentially saying here. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. So mutual rejection. Saul's not happy about this, and he does beg at this point. He admits his sin. He knows he's done something wrong. I beg you, forgive me. Come worship with me. Let's set this right with God. If you know what God wants, let's try to rectify this. Samuel, I think, has this complicated feelings of like, I've gone through all of this with you. I've walked alongside you. I tried to help you. I want to help you, but God isn't on your side anymore. And he rips his robe, and Samuel kind of uses this as an object lesson. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today. This is in verse 28, and given it to one of your neighbors. We don't know this guy yet, but we're about to one better than you. He who is the glory of Israel does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a human being that he should change his mind. We hear a quality of God is that he's made this decision and he's standing by it. And Saul again says that he's sinned and he wants to rectify this, come back with me. And then Samuel, it's not like God to change his mind, but Samuel might. He's going to go worship with Saul, and they worship the Lord. And then Samuel brings out Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and kills him. The kind of downer of an ending to this story, at least in this chapter, of like, cool, I'll worship with you. Hey, remember that king from the Amalekites? Let's kill him in our worship. Not a part of our liturgy and worship at Memorial Drive, not pulling out people to execute them. Thanks be to God for that. And then we get this kind of account, because we'll see more of Samuel and of Saul, but in different places. Samuel left for Ramah, but Saul went up to his home in Gibeah of Saul. Until the day Samuel died, he did not go see Saul again. They didn't interact again. This is their last interaction. Though Samuel mourned for him, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. There's this scene in the first Toy Story movie where Woody has a nightmare. Woody is the main character, played by Tom Hanks. And Andy, the kid in the movie, is growing up and setting his toys aside. And Woody has this nightmare that Andy drops him and says, I don't want to play with you anymore. I think that's kind of the picture that we get in 1 Samuel. Like, God is done with Saul. He doesn't want to play with him anymore. He's taken his confirmation away. So the question I kind of want to ask, and I know I'm a little bit over time, but I just want to end with these questions. Whose fault is it for all this kind of mismatched desire, for all of this family dynamic, household dynamic, conflict? Is it the fault of Israel, their desires to be like other nations? Does it really lie with them? Is it their motivation for a king that kind of set all this in motion? What was the reasoning behind their wanting a king? Was it because of Nahash and it threatened their stability? Was it because of Samuel's sons that threatened their stability? Was it Saul's willful disobedience? Was it Samuel's own chess moves? I think we kind of give a lot of credit to Samuel for being like the righteous guy, but he didn't show up in 7 days. There's maybe some fault in Samuel. Or is it Yahweh's testing faithfulness? Like, is it God's fault? Like, God kind of set these things in motion to teach a lesson. I think there's a faithful, yeah, do you say it's all of them? I think there's maybe a faithful reading of scripture to say, like, we're conditioned culturally to find one person to blame, to find one party to blame. I think 1 Samuel kind of masterfully shows us, and maybe it's because it is multiple authors, people that are pro-monarchy or anti-monarchy, feel like it's everybody's fault. This did not go well. Nobody really played by the rules. And so we have our own kind of difficult men of 1 Samuel. There's Samuel and Saul and Jonathan, Winnie the Pooh, and Yahweh, who are these complicated, sometimes present, sometimes not, sometimes faithful, sometimes not, sometimes listening, sometimes not, doing their own thing, working with a group. I think if we don't have to pick one as the hero. I think we get that from like Greek mythology or kind of Greek stories, Greco-Roman stories. There's Odysseus. He's the central guy. He's the hero. And of course, God is the central character of all of the Bible. But I think in this story, in the monarchy story, we can kind of see this complication of people with their own agendas, with their own desires, with their own wants and needs at play here. And just here's some theological considerations. We've talked about all these, but 2 books I'd recommend. The one that's in the back that's kind of dark, you can't see, is called Crucifixion of the Warrior God. It's 2 volumes. It was very long, but would recommend it to you, by Gregory Boyd, as a Bible scholar and theologian. Talks about how we read the Old Testament in the shadow of the cross. So it might help you understand some of those moments where it seems to say that God is saying, kill everything and everybody. That doesn't sound a lot like Jesus. I think Greg Boyd gives a good reading of that. And then this other book, Getting Involved with God, Rediscovering the Old Testament. Ellen Davis is an Old Testament, I think she's now retired, but Old Testament scholar and professor at Duke Divinity School in North Carolina. I have a copy of it if you want to come look at it. I will happily lend it to you if you'll read it. Very good book, and will help you also understand the character of the God of Israel as we find him, especially in 1st and 2nd Samuel. She looks at the Psalms and some other texts, but great book. Just wanted to recommend resources to you. Q&A will be one-on-one as I let you go about your days and do your thing. Sorry I kept us a little over, but it's good to be with you today. Thanks for being here.